Chosen one, this message is not here by accident, and you need to understand that before anything else. You did not come across these words randomly, and you did not click on this by coincidence. You are here because something in your spirit has been trying to warn you for a long time, and today that warning is becoming too clear to ignore. There is a pattern around your life that has gone on long enough. There is a cycle that has drained you long enough. There is a pain you have kept calling love, a burden you have kept calling loyalty, and a wound you have kept covering with the word forgiveness. But the truth is finally standing in front of you, and heaven is saying it is time to call this pattern by its real name. If you keep forgiving without boundaries, you will keep bleeding. If you keep reopening the same door to the same people with the same behavior and the same excuses, you will keep suffering the same pain in a different form. If you keep giving sacred access to people who have already shown you how casually they handle your heart, you will keep ending up exhausted, confused, and spiritually drained. If you keep making room for those who disrespect your peace, your healing will never stay long enough to restore you. That is why this message is urgent. That is why this word is direct. And that is why this cycle has to stop now. Forgiveness is holy, and forgiveness matters. Forgiveness is powerful, and forgiveness is necessary. But forgiveness was never meant to become permission for repeated harm. That is where so many chosen ones have become trapped. You thought forgiving meant pretending it did not hurt. You thought forgiving meant reopening every door. You thought forgiving meant giving endless access. You thought forgiving meant that every apology deserved immediate closeness. But that is not wisdom. That is not healing. And that is not spiritual maturity. That is how people with pure hearts get drained by those who know exactly how to take without ever truly changing. Some of you already know exactly what this message is talking about. You know what it feels like to welcome someone back after they hurt you, only to feel the same heaviness return almost immediately. You know what it feels like to silence your own discernment because you do not want to seem cold. You know what it feels like to hear an apology and want so badly for it to be real that you ignore what the pattern has already proved. You know what it feels like to keep extending mercy while your own soul quietly breaks in the background. That is why this word found you today. Not to make you bitter, not to make you hard, and not to make you hateful, but to wake you up. There is a difference between being loving and being available for harm. There is a difference between being merciful and being easy to access. There is a difference between releasing offense and allowing repeated injury. And the Lord is saying that some of you have confused a soft heart with an unguarded life. Hear this clearly. You can forgive and still say no. You can forgive and still walk away. You can forgive and still decide that someone no longer has the right to reach you in the same way. You can forgive and still protect the part of you that took too long to heal. That is not contradiction. That is wisdom. Your heart is not a public place. Your peace is not for casual consumption. Your emotional strength is not something everybody gets to touch just because they know how to say sorry after they cross the line. Some people have learned your compassion, but they have never respected your boundaries. They know you will answer. They know you will listen. They know you will pray. They know you will try again. And because they know that, they keep returning to the same gate, expecting the same access. But this time, something must change. Every time you ignore what God showed you, you pay for it with peace. Every time you override discernment to preserve someone else's comfort, you pay for it with confusion. Every time you keep a door open that heaven has already warned you about, you pay for it with energy, clarity, sleep, and strength. That price is too high. You were not called to spend your life recovering from wounds that wisdom could have prevented. You were not chosen to become a constant source of grace for people who never become accountable. You were not anointed to bleed endlessly just because you have the capacity to love deeply. Love deeply, yes. Forgive sincerely, yes. Release bitterness, yes. But bleed forever? No. That ends here. So let this settle in your spirit before we go any further. Just because you forgave them does not mean they get to return to the same level of access. Just because you are healing does not mean they are safe. Just because they said the words does not mean they have changed the pattern. Patterns tell the truth that apologies often try to hide. And today, that truth is standing in the light. Chosen one. One of the hardest lessons you will ever learn is that not everyone who says sorry is ready to stop causing damage. Not everyone who comes back has been transformed. Not everyone who cries in front of you has truly repented. Some people are not returning because they honor your heart. They are returning because they miss the access. They miss the comfort. They miss the covering. They miss the version of you that was always available, always understanding, always willing to carry pain in silence just to keep the peace. And that is why discernment matters now more than ever. You have to understand this clearly. A repeated wound is no longer just a wound. It is a pattern. And patterns reveal character in ways that words never can. A person can say all the right things and still carry the same spirit. A person can sound remorseful and still remain unsafe. A person can promise change and still be completely committed to the old behavior. That is why heaven is telling you to stop judging this season by emotion and start judging it by fruit. Look at what follows them. Look at what enters your life when they enter your space. Look at what happens to your peace, your focus, your rest, your joy, and your spiritual clarity every time you let them back in. The fruit tells the truth. For too long, you have been trying to give people the benefit of the doubt, while your own spirit was sending you warning after warning. You felt the heaviness. You noticed the inconsistency. You saw the pattern. You heard the half-truths, the delayed honesty, the manipulation hidden inside soft words, and the subtle disrespect covered by excuses. You noticed how the relationship always seemed to cost you more than it cost them. You noticed how you were always the one doing the forgiving, always the one doing the understanding, always the one trying to hold everything together. And yet you kept telling yourself to be patient, to be loving, to be gracious one more time. But chosen one, wisdom is now asking you a serious question. How many times will you call a warning a test of patience when it is actually a signal to step back? Because some of you have been taught a version of love that leaves no room for self-respect. You were taught that being good meant being endlessly available. You were taught that being spiritual meant never disappointing anyone. You were taught that if you set limits, you were being difficult. If you became less accessible, you were being cold. If you stopped explaining yourself, you were being selfish. But those lies have kept many of you trapped in cycles that heaven never asked you to maintain. The truth is that boundaries are not rebellion. Boundaries are alignment. Boundaries are what happen when love becomes wise enough to stop feeding what is harming it. And that may be exactly what this message is trying to break off of you today. The guilt attached to protecting yourself. The guilt attached to silence. The guilt attached to distance. The guilt attached to not answering immediately, not reopening the conversation, not returning to the same dynamic, not offering the same access, and not pretending everything is fine just because enough time has passed. Time by itself does not heal patterns. Distance by itself does not create character. Words by themselves do not produce trust. Trust is built by consistency, and consistency cannot be faked for long. You need to hear that again. Trust is built by consistency, and consistency cannot be faked for long. That is why you do not need to rush. That is why you do not need to prove your goodness by instantly restoring what was broken. That is why you do not need to hand back access just because someone feels uncomfortable being held at a distance. Their discomfort is not your assignment. Their frustration is not your burden. Their impatience is not your emergency. If they are truly changing, then truth will survive boundaries. If they are truly sincere, then sincerity will survive time. If they are truly sent by God to remain in your life, then your obedience will not destroy what heaven intended to keep. Chosen one, some doors stay open only because you are afraid of what closing them will force you to admit. You are afraid that if you really shut the door, you will have to accept that they were not who you hoped they were. You will have to accept that your compassion was used. You will have to accept that your loyalty was not matched. You will have to accept that the history was real, but the future you imagined may not be. And that kind of truth hurts. It hurts deeply. But there is something more painful than accepting the truth once, and that is bleeding from the same wound over and over because you refuse to close what should have been closed a long time ago. So today, heaven is not just speaking comfort. Heaven is issuing instruction. Stop making permanent room for temporary apologies. Stop giving deep access to shallow change. Stop confusing guilt with conviction. Stop confusing nostalgia with discernment. Stop confusing familiarity with safety. Just because someone has been in your life for a long time does not mean they belong in your next season. Just because someone knows your story does not mean they deserve your vulnerability. Just because you love them does not mean they are qualified to stay close. This is where many chosen ones delay their own healing. They keep waiting for one final sign, one final sentence, one final apology, one final conversation, one final moment of clarity. But the truth is that clarity has already been showing itself in pieces. It was there in how your spirit reacted after each interaction. It was there in how your peace disappeared when they re-entered your world. It was there in how tired you felt after trying once again to make something work that only survives when you abandon yourself. You do not need 10 more signs when the pattern has already spoken. And now the Lord is asking you to honor what was revealed. Chosen one, this is the moment where many people turn back. This is the moment where they hear the truth, feel the conviction, recognize the pattern, and then immediately begin negotiating with the very thing that has been draining them. They start saying things like, maybe I am being too harsh. Maybe I should give it one more chance. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe they did not mean it that way. Maybe this time will be different. But hear me clearly. When your spirit has already been wounded by the same pattern again and again, one more chance is not always mercy. Sometimes it is disobedience disguised as compassion. This is why you must stop letting emotion speak louder than discernment. Emotion remembers the history. Emotion remembers the good moments. Emotion remembers who they were when they were kind, when they were close, when they made you feel seen, when they promised things that sounded beautiful. But discernment looks at fruit. Discernment looks at consistency. Discernment looks at what happens after the words are spoken. And that is the place where truth becomes impossible to hide. Because no matter how moving the apology sounds, no matter how soft the voice becomes, no matter how many tears fall, the real question is simple. What happens next? Does the pattern break, or does it return? Does the respect deepen, or does the same carelessness reappear? Does your peace remain, or does confusion come rushing back into your spirit the moment they regain access? Chosen one, there are people who do not need your explanation. They need your absence. There are situations that do not need one more emotional conversation. They need a clean decision. There are relationships that do not need another rescue. They need accountability, distance, and truth. And that may sound hard for some of you because you have spent so much time trying to be the healer in every room that you forgot healing is not the same thing as enabling. Supporting someone is not the same thing as surrendering your peace. Loving someone is not the same thing as letting them keep injuring you. Praying for someone is not the same thing as allowing them unrestricted access to your mind, your emotions, and your spiritual atmosphere. Some of you have been carrying people that God never told you to carry. You have been keeping connections alive out of guilt, fear, pity, history, or loneliness. You have been calling it assignment, but in many cases, it is attachment. You have been calling it intercession, but in many cases, it is entanglement. You have been calling it loyalty, but in many cases, it is the fear of disappointing others. And because of that, you have remained tied to places and people that continuously interrupt your peace. But the Lord is saying, this is the hour where false obligations break. This is the hour where you stop confusing love with self-erasure. This is the hour where you stop sacrificing your emotional and spiritual stability just to maintain proximity with people who refuse to respect the weight of your presence. You need to understand something very important. The enemy does not always attack by force. Sometimes he attacks by access. Sometimes he sends pressure through familiar voices, repeated patterns, emotional manipulation, and relationships that seem small on the outside, but quietly drain your anointing over time. Not every open door is harmless. Not every reconnection is innocent. Not every return is from God. And that is why you cannot afford to be careless with access in this season. The wrong access will confuse your mind, drain your strength, weaken your focus, and delay your healing. The wrong access will keep reopening battles that heaven was trying to close. The wrong access will keep you emotionally occupied with what God is trying to move you beyond. That is why this message is not only about pain. It is about stewardship. It is about guarding what God restored in you. It is about protecting what took prayer to rebuild. It is about honoring the healing you cried for. You did not come this far just to hand yourself back over to a cycle that almost broke you. You did not survive those nights of confusion, those seasons of betrayal, those moments when your heart felt crushed, just to return to the same table with the same blindness. No, there has to be a line now. There has to be a standard now. There has to be a holy refusal rising inside of you that says, I will not keep paying with my peace for the comfort of people who refuse to change. And yes, chosen one, some people will be offended when you change your level of access. Some will call you different. Some will say you have changed. Some will accuse you of becoming distant, cold, proud, or selfish. But what they often call cold is really clarity. What they call distance is really wisdom. What they call pride is often the first time you stopped abandoning yourself to keep them comfortable. Let them name it however they want. Your assignment is not to make everyone understand your boundary. Your assignment is to obey what God has shown you. You are not responsible for making your obedience convenient for people who benefited from your lack of limits. So stop apologizing for what is saving your life. Stop feeling guilty for what is protecting your spirit. Stop calling yourself difficult because you are no longer easy to misuse. This change in you is not cruelty. It is growth. It is not bitterness. It is discernment. It is not punishment. It is protection. And in this season, protection is holy. Protection is obedience. Protection is wisdom in motion. The same God who told you to forgive is also the God who teaches you to guard your heart, test the fruit, and stop entertaining what repeatedly brings chaos into your life. And today, that instruction is becoming very clear. You can release them in prayer and still remove their access in real life. You can wish them well and still keep the door closed. You can love from a distance and still remain fully aligned with heaven. Chosen one, there comes a point when healing demands proof that you have learned from what hurt you. There comes a point when growth is no longer measured by how much pain you can tolerate, but by how quickly you recognize what no longer deserves access to you. And that is where many of you are standing right now. You are no longer in the season where everything confuses you. You are no longer in the season where every red flag looks like a test of patience. You are no longer in the season where every apology automatically restores intimacy. You have seen too much. You have felt too much. You have lost too much peace, pretending not to know what your spirit already knew. So now the question is no longer whether the pattern is real. The question is whether you will finally respond to it with obedience. Because this is what some of you have been doing for far too long. You have been waiting for the other person to become clear enough that you no longer have to wrestle with your own decision. You have been waiting for them to say something extreme, do something final, cross one last obvious line so that leaving, limiting, or closing the door feels easier. But chosen one, delayed action is still costly action. Every day you stay open to what God has already exposed, you keep paying in peace. Every day you keep entertaining what repeatedly drains you, you keep delaying your own restoration. Every day you ignore the quiet check in your spirit, you teach yourself to distrust the very discernment heaven gave you to protect you. That is why this word is not just emotional. It is governmental. Heaven is trying to put order back into your inner world. Heaven is trying to restore authority in the places where guilt has been ruling you. Heaven is trying to break the false belief that being a good person means remaining reachable to everybody, available to everybody, responsive to everybody, and endlessly understanding toward everybody. No, that is not righteousness. That is disorder. That is how chaos gains legal ground in your life. And when chaos gains legal ground through repeated access, it does not just affect one relationship. It affects your prayer life, your focus, your rest, your confidence, and your ability to hear clearly. Some of you have noticed that every time certain people come back into your world, your mind becomes noisy. Your peace weakens. Your emotions become unstable. You start replaying conversations, questioning yourself, explaining yourself, defending yourself, and carrying a heaviness that was not there before. That is not something to ignore. That is information. That is fruit. That is evidence. Stop trying to spiritualize what your nervous system, your spirit, and your peace have already been reporting to you. Stop calling it sensitivity when it is actually discernment. Stop calling it fear when it is actually wisdom. Stop calling it overreaction when it is actually your spirit refusing to go numb again. Chosen one, not every person who returns deserves the same version of you they once had access to. That version of you prayed through too much, cried through too much, survived too much, and rebuilt too much to remain unguarded. You had to learn things in pain that now need to become principles in peace. You had to discover in darkness what safety really means. You had to realize that not everybody who says they love you knows how to handle you with care. And once you know that, You cannot go back to being careless with your gates. You cannot go back to handing out trust where there has been no consistency. You cannot go back to calling something safe just because it is familiar. Familiarity has trapped many people in cycles that wisdom was trying to end. And let me say something else very directly. Some of you keep reopening doors because you are afraid of being alone. But loneliness is not a reason to tolerate what keeps harming you. Emptiness is not a reason to reconnect with confusion. Missing someone is not a reason to restore access to someone who repeatedly dishonored your peace. Nostalgia can be dangerous when it edits out the pain and only remembers the parts that make you want to return. Be careful. Memory can become an accomplice to bondage when it refuses to tell the whole truth. And the whole truth is not just that there were good moments. The whole truth is also that the pattern cost you dearly. So what must happen now? A decision. A clean one. A serious one. A decision that no longer waits for everyone else to agree. A decision that no longer depends on whether they understand. A decision that no longer collapses the moment guilt starts talking. You need a boundary that does not negotiate every time pressure appears. You need a standard that does not disappear every time someone becomes emotional. You need an inner line that remains where God placed it, even when people try to move it with tears, history, familiarity, or temporary remorse. Because if your boundary only survives in easy moments, then it is not yet a boundary. It is only a preference, and preferences do not stop cycles. Authority does. This is why many chosen ones stay trapped. They set boundaries with their mouth, but not with their conviction. They say, "This cannot continue," but inside they are still waiting to be talked out of their own clarity. They say, "Things have to change," but they still leave the door unlocked for the same pattern to return the moment they feel guilt or pressure. And heaven is saying that your healing deserves more than weak agreement. Your peace deserves structure. Your life deserves order. Your future deserves protection. If you know what repeatedly wounds you, then love must become brave enough to close the gate. Not someday, not after one more cycle, not after one more draining conversation. Now. So hear this final truth for this part. Boundaries are not the opposite of forgiveness. Boundaries are often the proof that forgiveness has become mature. When forgiveness is mature, it no longer confuses release with reunion. It no longer confuses compassion with access. It no longer confuses kindness with the removal of consequence. Mature forgiveness can bless someone without bringing them close. Mature forgiveness can pray for someone without reopening the same injury. Mature forgiveness can let go of hatred while still protecting what God has restored. And that is the level of wisdom heaven is calling you into now. Chosen one, the reason this message is pressing so strongly on your spirit is because what you tolerate in this season will try to define the next one. And heaven is not willing to let your next season be built on the same leaks, the same exhaustion, the same repeated disappointments, and the same access points that have already cost you too much. There are some people who only remain powerful in your life because you never fully close the gate. There are some cycles that only keep returning because you keep leaving room for them to re-enter. There are some wounds that never fully heal because the source is still allowed to touch the same place again and again. That is why this is serious. This is not about being dramatic. This is not about holding grudges. This is about ending agreement with what keeps draining the life out of you. Some of you are still hoping that the people who hurt you will eventually understand how deeply they affected you. And maybe they will, but maybe they will not. Some of you are still waiting for the perfect apology, the perfect confession, the perfect moment of accountability that finally makes everything make sense. But chosen one, Closure does not always come through their understanding. Sometimes closure comes through your decision. Sometimes peace does not arrive because they finally said the right thing. Sometimes peace arrives because you stopped requiring one more conversation in order to obey what God already made clear. Waiting for them to become fully self-aware may keep you bound longer than necessary. Waiting for them to validate your pain may keep the door open to more pain. At some point, your obedience has to become stronger than your need for explanation. And let that sink in deeply. Your obedience has to become stronger than your need for explanation. Because explanation can become a trap. It can make you feel as if you are only allowed to protect yourself once the other person agrees with your reasons. It can make you feel as if your boundary is only legitimate if everybody understands it, approves it, and calls it fair. But the truth is that many boundaries are born in private conviction, not public approval. Many holy decisions are made in silence, not in group consensus. Many acts of obedience will be misunderstood by the very people who benefited from your confusion. And you must be mature enough to let that misunderstanding remain without breaking your own alignment. That is difficult for many of you because your heart is naturally compassionate. You do not enjoy distance. You do not enjoy shutting doors. You do not enjoy becoming less available. You do not enjoy disappointing people. You do not enjoy confronting the reality that someone you cared for deeply may not be safe for your next season. But just because something is painful does not mean it is wrong. Surgery is painful, but it saves. Separation is painful, but it protects. Truth is painful, but it liberates. And what God is doing in you right now is not cruelty. It is precision.